Hi, everyone. Welcome again to another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. I'm Lenny Esposito, and today we bring you part two in our continuing discussion with Dr. Stephen C. Meyer of the Discovery Institute. As I said last week, I was able to sit down with my colleague Anthony Costello through the Kirkwood Center for Theology and Ethics, an organization for which we are both fellows, and talk to Dr. Meyer about all things intelligent design. Not only that, we were able to expand our conversations about really the philosophy of science in general and how we understand the way science works, what counts as evidence, and how the scientific enterprise grew from certain presuppositions that are fundamental to the Christian faith. It's an engaging, if a little bit academic discussion, but I hope you'll enjoy it and learn quite a bit in this interesting exchange. So stay tuned for the Come Let Us Reason Together podcast.
Okay, I want to move a little bit more now into, well, maybe sort of questions about philosophy of science and more generally. I mean, again, so the book goes through all the evidences from the fine-tuning cosmology, then the chemical problems, abiogenesis, and then of course into the problems in biological organisms with the explosion of novel body parts, combinatorial problems with the sequence space. So it's all in there. And of course, the best explanation that comes out for all these forms, sequences, and structures and functions that we see in nature is mind, right? I mean, this is what we're moving towards, you're moving towards in the book. But now some might say, given that we're sort of living in a culture now that's, at least at the moment, dominated by what I would call a sort of anti-realism or social theory. And I would just say something like, well, scientific claims or truth claims at all are just products of the communities that make them. So this sort of idea that any kind of claim to truth is not really referential to an external reality, but we sort of produce reality through our language. And there is a strain of anti-realism with regards to science as well. And I wonder if you could speak to this. I want our audience, so I want Christians to understand this idea that there is an anti-realism about scientific claims and whether they're not just productions of the individual, the community, that this is kind of a problem, social construct theory, you might call it as well. And, how would we respond to that sort of approach to, maybe that's just an approach to truth itself?
Yeah, well, it's important to understand how the philosophy of science has ended up in this epistemological cul-de-sac or dead end. The department I was in Cambridge as a PhD student had some very prominent sociologists of knowledge who believed that knowledge was indeed constructed, that there was no mind-independent reality, or certainly no mind-independent reality that could be known in any objective sense. I mean, the obvious problem with that is that nobody actually lives as if that were true. They don't believe that knowledge is just a construct of a small group of people or a community that they happen to be part of, because there would be no reason to believe that one construct as opposed to another is any more or less likely to be true, and therefore that really there isn't a mind of independent reality, because you've got different groups constructing reality differently. But yet we live as if there is one truth out there that has to be reckoned with. Going back to David Hume, a critique of his skepticism was that at the end of the day, he still walked through the door and not the window. And the sociologists of knowledge, the same, they must do that. So our philosophy of science doesn't match the way we live, which is to say, at some level, we don't really believe it. We live as though something else were true, that there is a mind-independent reality that can be known. And so that then, with that said, it then raises the question, well, on what basis can we trust the reliability of the mind? We're all living as though our minds are basically reliable instruments for knowing an objective reality outside our minds. And I think this is where again, theism has a great deal to offer as by way of explanation. And this was it's actually one of the reasons that the scientific revolution began in the first place, is that the early scientists were convinced that nature was intelligible. It could be understood by the human mind, because the human mind had been made by the same mind who had made the natural world and had imbued the natural world with reason, with a kind of rationality, regularity, and design that we could understand. That there was a principle of correspondence between, as the Cambridge physicist John Polkinghorne used to put it, the reason within matches the reason without. You know, the reason we have been endowed with certain assumptions about reality that allow us to process sense data, a la Kant, and those assumptions are reliable because they were given to us by the same creator who created the world to work in accord with those assumptions. So we have Hume famously argued for skepticism on the basis of it's a fascinating little proof that he has, where he shows that inductive reasoning depends upon a principle known as the uniformity of nature. Sorry about this little camera sliding. And the uniformity of nature can't be justified apart from inductive reasoning. And so he showed that we were stuck in a circle, in circular reasoning, if all we have to go on is empirical data. So he was a strict empiricist, and he showed you couldn't prove either induction or uniformity from empirical data. But if you have a prior reason for assuming that for thinking that the assumptions we make about the world are accurate to the way the world was made, you don't worry about that problem. And that was the case of the early founders of modern science, who believed that nature was intelligible. And in some ways, this goes back then to Augustine and his famous credo ut intelligam, believe in order to know. If you believe first in God, then you have a basis for trusting in the reliability of the mind, and then science is possible.
Right.
The very ironic conclusion of late 20th century, early 21st century philosophy of science is that if you reject belief in God, you end up undermining confidence in knowledge, in scientia, and therefore you have a kind of strange binary choice. Believe in God, and then you can know the world, you can have science, or reject belief in God and undermine the basis for knowledge about the world and therefore science. So,
right.
And this comes out. Yeah, and so this is,
and you go through the history of that in the first part of the book. You really do a good job of laying out the history of theistic science, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But also at the end, and I guess you're not quite to that point yet, but I come back to this epistemological argument from it's called the argument for theism from epistemological necessity, and this is part of what Alvin Plantinga's work is about. It is what Plantinga's work is about in his magisterial set of tomes, Warrant and Proper Function, and showing that naturalism, conjoined with an evolutionary account of the human mind, leads to a self-defeating account of the reliability of the mind, whereas theism provides an adequate basis for believing in the reliability of the mind. So this is the fundamental question at bottom in philosophy of science, is on what basis can we or should we not trust the reliability of the human mind? And it was, sort of in modern philosophy, the sequence, Hume followed by Kant, and then into the more contemporary figures. But it was, Hume showed that on the basis of pure empiricism, we can't trust the reliability of the mind. Kant came back and showed that, well, kind of amplified that thesis in a way by showing that there were structures of the mind. He called them the synthetic a priori. There was a dozen or so assumptions that we make about how nature works, or that are necessary, that our mind necessarily uses to process the empirical data that we receive, and that's how we construct our understanding or images of reality. Our sense perception is massaged by the assumptions that are built into our minds. Now, Kant believed we couldn't ask the question, well, on what basis are those assumptions true or false? Because he said we have to use them to think at all. I think they can be cashed out as propositions. All the Kantian category of causality can be expressed as the proposition all events have causes, and so in each of the propositions or each of the categories similarly can be expressed propositionally. Well, if they're propositions, they're either true or false, and we can certainly ask which is the case. And it happens, I think, that theism provides a reason to believe that the categories of the mind that we use to process sense data are generally reliable, and
Yeah.
and so
Yeah.
there are things we can think about beyond the range of our sense perception, or there may be some caveats or provisos that we may want to offer, but the general reliability of the mind for knowing the world as it was made is something that flows out of theism and eliminates the epistemological crisis, the problem of postmodernism.
Yeah. And I think there's often
I'm a theistic realist.
right.
Yeah.
Because I think there's often a misunderstanding of Kant there. And this would be getting deep into the epistemological weeds. Maybe we do that another time when our colleague Doug Guyvet is with us. That one of the best sort of explications of Kant that I've ever read was in Stuart Hackett's book, The Resurrection of Theism, where he starts off with Kant's synthetic a priori, and he cashes that out in such a way where you get a realism, like you said, theistic realism, and the categories.
Kant made theistic arguments based on he had a moral argument for theism.
Right.
Didn't make an epistemological argument for theism, but I think he could easily have done so. And I've known,
and that's what I think Hackett does.
Yeah,
Hackett then says.
I had a friend in grad school, Eugenio Biagini, who went on to become a very prominent history professor at Princeton. I don't know if he's still there or not, but I remember him telling me that he had become a Christian by studying Kant. And it was the epistemological problem that led him to the conclusion of theism. And this, before I knew any of the scientific evidences for intelligent design, I'd become a convinced theist because of the argument from epistemological necessity.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, exactly. Yeah, that's good. That's right. Because too, when you start with that, then it eliminates the two problems of the 19th century, which is either the emergence of scientism, which will lead to, skepticism, or you mentioned briefly the dialectical materialism, which is more the Marxist side of the coin, that sort of places knowledge as just a pure product of the human will, right? Which is obviously also
a social construct of groups, I mean, the crude way of putting it was whoever gets the grant makes the theory, and
right.
So
or what was oh gosh, who was the I don't want to
there's obviously some sense to that. I mean, we can have a sociologically governed science, which is unhealthy, but the point is there's still a mind independent reality, and there are we want if we only have one perspective investigating nature, we'll probably only get one perspective at the end of nature. So this is the reason for the need to cultivate a multiple competing hypotheses approach. So there is an element of competition, theoretical competition in the scientific method. The Italian philosopher of science, Marcello Pera, he's not Irish, says science advances as scientists argue about how to interpret the evidence. So there needs to be this dialectical competition.
Right. More in the Platonic sense than in the Marxist sense, though, I think.
Sure, we're considering all possibilities and getting to the best one, which is part of what I argue for in critiquing methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism suppresses that competition and puts you in a situation where you may have garbage in, garbage out, where you assume the outcome of the investigation by the rules that you set up at the beginning of the investigation, rather than by letting the evidence speak.
Yeah.
It's
not
interesting.
Go ahead, Lenny.
It's interesting. In the Signature in the Cell, you made a point about talking about Frederick Wohler and his discovery of urea, and how he had pitted himself against the vitalist and felt that their constraints were what was hindering his science, that the idea that you can't investigate the life forces. Isn't this the same in reverse?
Yeah.
I mean, have we come full circle now, and aren't they doing that which they had initially complained about?
Yeah, well, I had a great conversation several years ago with Thomas Nagel, the atheistic philosopher of science, who nevertheless became disenchanted with the materialistic explanations for biological origins, and he perhaps foolishly wrote some nice things about my book in a commendation for the Times Literary Supplement in the Signature in the Cell back in 2009. And then he was attacked by fellow atheists for having done so. But he ended up doubling down, and he wrote his own book called Mind and Cosmos, how the materialist neo-Darwinian account of reality is almost certainly false. Subtitle. Yeah. And his point was, we know that minds exist. We know them, as J.P. Moreland points out, by direct introspective experience. And any account of reality that eliminates mind as an important player, causally or otherwise, is impoverished. It's missing something. And methodological naturalism sets out to impoverish. It requires us to investigate nature from that impoverished point of view. At the out. We can't consider creative intelligence as having played any role in any of the things that we see around us and want to investigate.
To include ourselves, which
including ourselves, because we have to give it a reductive account of our own minds.
The planning is
very weirdly self-contradictory, because if we, that is to say, we conscious agents, are giving a reductive account of our own minds, the account of our own minds is inconsistent with the enterprise we've just engaged in. It's very weirdly so
you got the self-defeating. If you take the strict metaphysical and methodological natural, you got a self-defeating aspect to it there, and then also you can't go the postmodern route. Rorty was the other philosopher who I think he said something like, "Truth is what my colleagues let me get away with," or something.
Right. And you have the bifurcation in the philosophy of science between the anti-realist or sociologists of knowledge, who want to say that
it's all
knowledge
social product,
relative to persons and groups and socially constructed, without referring to a definite mind-independent reality. And then you have the positivists, who are essentially just the children of Hume, who want to say that the only knowledge that we can have is knowledge that's of empirical objects, the knowledge we can gain through the senses. But the problem is that the mind is active in processing that sense data. There are assumptions that we make in order to do science that have nothing to do with empirical data. The assumption of the uniformity of nature, for example, that there are faith commitments that are involved in science, and the pointing out of those faith commitments is what has led to the postmodern turn.
Yeah.
But if you have an independent reason for thinking that those faith commitments are reliable, and I think theism provides that, then you can avoid the horns of this dilemma. You have a reason to believe that you can know the world, and that there is an objective reality there to be known. And yes, there is a sociological dimension to that. One group can become dominant. People can have biases. They may have unscientific reasons for holding a particular theory over another. But that's also the human condition.
Yes.
A theistic point of view after the fall. But just as in the realm of government, we want to have checks and balances. In the realm of science, we want to have theoretical competition, because that's that is the best way that we've come up with for gaining a closer and closer approximation to the truth without ever losing confidence that there is a truth out there to be known.
Right. That's great. And when I think too, what we're seeing, we talked about earlier at the beginning when we were in with Murray and Holland, guys like this, that sense of now, either if you're on the positivist strain or the postmodernist strain, there's an existential crisis that inevitably occurs. You know, if you take those routes to their fullest extent, and then all of a sudden, it's not just about abstract metaphysics. It's about morality. It's about how we put our societies together. It's about law and everything else. And then the rubber hits the road. I think it was Isaiah Berlin who said, all culture is a society trying to live out a metaphysical model, testing out a metaphysical model to see then how it actually winds up working out. And, these alternative 19th century views, they're not working out very well. People see that they don't work out in the concrete, and then they take a step back and say, well, what happened? Where do we need to course correct? So, okay, now we got to get to this. This has been great. I know I want to respect your time, but we got to get to this more theological question now. You do talk in the book about some figures who hold to some people who hold to a more theistic evolutionary view. Dennis Lemereau. Lemereau is the gentleman that you mentioned specifically, but I know there are others. I think Peter Van Ingwagen has a view like this, the philosopher of science, and also I think Howard Van Til, who was a theologian at, I think, Calvin College. This idea of, and this has to do with what we might call divine action or intervention. So this sort of directly relates to the theological doctrine of God's providence, I would say. So tell us a little bit about these. Maybe some of them are deistic, but maybe they're more than deistic views, these front-loaded views of God's design, and how the distinction between those views and the view that you're defending, where God is more, or the designing intelligence is more involved in supplying information in periods of history, new influxes of information.
Right. Well, there are many different versions of what's called theistic evolution, or sometimes now the theistic evolutionists are calling their own view evolutionary creation. And part of the reason for that is that there are many different meanings associated with the term evolution. Evolution can mean change over time. It can mean universal common ancestry, that all organisms are related by common ancestry going back to one single form, such that the history of life can be best depicted as a great branching tree. Or there's the idea that the process that produced all the change depicted by the branching tree is unguided and undirected. It is, the process that produced it is the mechanism of natural selection and random mutations, variations, or similarly undirected materialistic processes. So it can refer to the simple fact of change, it can refer to a pattern, or it can refer to a process where typically the evolutionary theorists will affirm that the process is unguided and undirected, and they will do that for a very important reason. That's part of the logic of Darwinism in the first place. The 19th century biologists all agreed that life gave the appearance of design. There were things about living systems that looked as if they'd been designed by an intelligent agent. Darwin came along and said, well, I can explain that appearance of design as a result of an unguided, undirected process, namely natural selection. It's not something like a human breeder or a divine creator selecting the attributes that are meant to, that give an organism, make an organism adapted to its environment. Rather, there's a natural process that does that. So it's natural selection doing the work rather than an intelligent agent of any kind. And so this was part of the logic of Darwinism in the very first place, is that the appearance of design could be explained by a purely natural process. And so therefore, that process is unguided and undirected, because if it's being directed and guided, then it's no longer apparent design, it's real design. But the Darwinists have wanted to say, as Dawkins says on the first page of The Blind Watchmaker, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So this is inherent in the Darwinian program. And so we've pointed out a number of things. Number one, if that third meaning of evolution is what's being affirmed, it's very hard to reconcile that with a meaningful notion of theism, or certainly of a theistic creation. If God is guiding, you either have a logical problem or a theological problem. If God is guiding the unguided process, after all, then it's no longer unguided, in which case that is actually a form of intelligent design, but the theistic evolutionists have typically been very critical of intelligent design. They reject it. But it can also lead to a theological problem, because if you think that God isn't directing the undirected process, that the purely natural processes are doing all the work, then that leads to some form of diminished divine sovereignty. God, it may be, as some theistic evolutionists affirm, upholding the laws of nature. He may have even acted at the beginning of creation, but from the beginning till now, he's essentially watching the process of creation from the mezzanine, passively perhaps upholding a basic law-like substrate for nature, but allowing the random mutations and the process of natural selection to do the actual work of creation. Mm-hmm. Now, the view of the version of theistic evolution that and beyond that, there's a scientific problem, which of course is for us the main problem. The mutation selection mechanism has very limited creative power. And this has been increasingly acknowledged by leading evolutionary biologists. I attended in 2016 a conference at the Royal Society. It was kicked off by a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist named Gerd Müller. And he started by enumerating what he called the explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And he had 5 very formidable problems that he identified with the theory. The principal problem, though, is that the mutation selection mechanism does a very nice job of explaining small-scale variations, but it does not do anything like an adequate job of explaining the origin of major morphological innovations, the major changes in form and structure that we see arising rather abruptly, in fact, throughout the fossil record. And so there's a kind of irony in all this, and this is a great push among well-funded theistic evolutionary groups to in a sense, baptize some form of Darwinian evolution or the extended synthesis or some purely materialistic evolutionary theory as the means by which God created, at the very time when leading evolutionary biologists are questioning the creative power of the main evolutionary mechanisms.
Right. So this idea of, this idea that God creates a self-making process. Or I think I don't know if it was in your book or in this chapter I read from Robin Collins, where he quotes Polkinghorne saying, quote, this is Polkinghorne, who I know you also met in your career. A world allowed to make itself is better than a puppet theater of a cosmic tyrant. Now, there's something in there, obviously, about the problem of evil. Maybe we'll get to that in a second. But
that's an idea that applies nicely in the free will defense to the problem of evil when you're talking about agency, but we don't think that quarks and electrons and planets and rocks have agency.
Have consciousness, right? Well, yeah. I
much respect Sir John's work in physics and in the theology of physics, but on that particular point, I'm deeply skeptical and think that that's a misapplication of the free will defense, applying in a sense, making a free will defense of theistic evolution. God is allowing nature to create itself and giving it agency separate from himself, and that's a mark of divine benevolence. I just think that's
Colin
So,
points that out in his chapter in the Oxford
yeah, I
Handbook.
think it's a confused application of that strategy of theistic argument. But it really doesn't address the key problems that we're addressing, which are primarily evidential. And I once had a chance to ask Polkinghorne, you've been so persuasive in making these design arguments based on physics, on the fine tuning, and yet arguably the complexity that we see in biological systems even exceeds what we see in those exquisitely finely tuned physical parameters. Why aren't you equally supportive of the design argument in biology? And he told me just candidly that he didn't know biology as well, and he didn't feel comfortable commenting on it, and he felt he needed to defer to the expertise of the biologists. And our point is that there is really no consensus now about how the evolutionary process worked. That it's completely broken down. If you read frontline people who are working in evolutionary biology, they will acknowledge the same problems that we're highlighting in our books. Nobody knows how you get a new body plan from an old body plan, given that to build a body plan, you have to have a developmental gene regulatory network, which is a tightly integrated circuitry for controlling cellular signaling that's necessary during animal development. So, and what we've learned is that those gene regulatory networks cannot be perturbed significantly without destroying animal development, and yet you need them to build animals. So just real simply, visual aid, circuitry to build animal A cannot be altered significantly, but to build animal B from animal A, you need a new developmental gene regulatory network. You need new circuitry. But if you can't alter the pre-existing circuitry to build that new circuitry, how will you ever get animal B? And this is a problem that was highlighted by Eric Davidson, the Caltech developmental biologist, who made this exhaustive study of these developmental gene regulatory networks. Basically, they are systems of genetic control that involve genes producing signals that turn on other genes at just the right time to service new cell types as they are differentiating one from another during the process of animal development, where you go from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to 64 to a geometric expansion in the number of cells. And as you're doing that, you're getting more and more different types of cells coming online. And when new types of cells arise, they need specific proteins to service them. If you're a gut cell, you need a digestive enzyme, et cetera. And there's a whole system of tightly regulated genetic control that is responsible. It's choreography.
Yeah.
And when you map out the functional relationships, it looks for all the world like an integrated circuit. And I got a picture of that in the book in chapter 15. Now, nobody, not the neo-Darwinists or any other newer model of evolutionary theory, has solved this really fundamental problem. And the reason for that is that all models of evolutionary theory involve change. They involve changing something into something else. And the one thing that we know about developmental gene regulatory networks, which are crucial for building new animal body plans, is that you can't alter them much without shutting down animal development altogether. Mm-hmm. It's the constraints problem of engineering. The more tightly integrated a system, the more difficult it is to perturb any part of it without defect to a whole. Now, people that know about problems like that are not making facile statements about how God used the evolutionary process to create, because the fundamental thing you want to be able to account for in the history of life is the origin of new body plans. That's morphological innovation. And there is a mechanistic impediment to doing that in a gradualistic evolutionary way that we have discovered. That
which
problem
would be necessary for the front-loaded view to...
Front-loaded view does not solve that, because it just says, okay, God created, maybe he fine-tuned the universe at the beginning, and then he just let things run on their own. Well, that doesn't solve any of these problems downstream in biology, because they're then attributing creativity to the standard Darwinian mechanisms, or
those mechanisms that have been proposed to supplement the mutation selection mechanism, but none of those solve problems like this. And then you have, as I point out in the book, other even deeper problems in that there's not enough information in the fine tuning or in the configuration of elementary particles or the plasma at the beginning of the universe to account for the information you need to build a biological cell. And I have a way of showing that very graphically in the book by looking at the DNA molecule and showing that even if you have all the parts of the DNA molecule, there are no forces of self-organization that will determine the sequencing that constitutes the information that the DNA holds. And so if there are no physical chemical forces relevant to, if the subunits, the highly biologically relevant and much more complex subunits of DNA do not have self-organizing forces that can account for the information that DNA contains, then a fortiori, so much the more, the much less complex, less biologically relevant elementary particles or plasma at the beginning of the universe did not have those that information or such forces either. And so the front end loaded idea just does not work scientifically. The evidence suggests that there were informational inputs after the beginning of the universe, which is contra-deism, but also contra-theistic evolution, especially in that model of front-end loading. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that the theistic evolutionists are deists, because they do hold that God is actively upholding the laws of nature.
His conservation of the laws of nature.
There's a preservation or conservation or
there's
upholding.
no concursive action at all.
There's no action. There's no discrete action. And so they want to limit God's, and this gets back to the question you asked about divine action. They want to limit divine action to one of the two powers that the medieval theologians affirmed.
Right.
They affirmed that there were two powers at least. One was the ordinary power, what they called the potentia ordinata, where God upheld the laws of nature. The book of Hebrews says that God sustains the universe by the word of his power. There's a sustaining power. He sustains the orderly concourse of nature. But he can also act as an agent within the matrix of natural law that he otherwise sustains and upholds. In other words, he can act discreetly at specific points in time that reveal in a more obvious way to us the reality of his action.
Which is also Romans 1:18-32.
Sure.
Right, as well.
And so this is what I think we see with these the abrupt appearance, the origin of life, the origin of animals. Gunter Beckley and I wrote an article about the 19 different fossil explosions. And in my view, there's absolutely no reason to deny some form of divine action at those points when we see these large increases in biological information in our biosphere. If we know that it takes a mind to generate information, when we see a large increase in same, then we have, I think, at least prima facie, evidence of divine action in a more discrete and discernible way than we see in the constant upholding of regularity.
Right.
So
yeah, go ahead, Lenny. Yes.
Even and you bring up a point, because even in I'm seeing in certain sections of biological origin that Darwin's tree is actually in doubt. That you have
certainly. I mean, we have fossil discontinuity. We now have genomic discontinuity with orphan genes that are pervasive across the phylogenetic landscape. The tree of life is, it's been with us for 160 years, but it's not consistent with many classes of.
Yeah, I think there was a panel discussion I saw where Dawkins was sitting with J. Craig Ventnor, and Ventnor offered some of these critiques, and Dawkins almost came off of his chair saying, "Are you actually doubting the tree of life?" But
yeah.
So
of course, we don't see the tree of life. The tree of life is an inference from 5 main classes of biological evidence, and what I've argued is that that those evidences are either now obsolete or they're equivocal, and that there are other classes of evidence that are suggesting a polyphyletic picture of the history of life. where you have multiple different groups, some of which are can be depicted as a tree. The relationships between some of the groups can be depicted in a tree-like way, but where the relationship between all of the groups is not best depicted as a single tree, but rather maybe an orchard of separate trees. So we don't deny that there are evolutionary processes, that the theory neo-Darwinism has applicability within a limited scope, but it does not seem to be the universally applicable account of biological phenomena that it was presented to be, even as late as 1959.
Well, Stephen, I want to get so yeah, this was something that I wanted to really dig into a little bit, because it bothered me. A few years back, I was at a theology conference here in the area in Los Angeles, very well-known theology conference, and it was on theological anthropology, and almost all of the panel speakers at some point referenced intelligent design, and they were just so dismissive. I mean, part of it is I don't think they really had engaged directly with your work, Behe's work, Doug Axe's work, and so on and so forth. They were just getting it from, a lot of them were British. They were just getting it from sort of the biologists that they knew. But that dismissal bothered me, not only because I didn't think they really had done their homework as theologians.
I think it's kind of
But you have a quote here let me do my Peter Robinson.
It's a tell, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, if people dismiss ideas without representing them accurately,
Yeah.
much less refuting them, it's a tell. It's an absolute tell of their own insecurity about their own position.
Yeah, I don't think that we're well informed. But
there's this sort of upset. We had a student one year who was at Oxford, and he was in our summer seminar, and he said, I can't tell you the number of times intelligent design has come up in my classes, but it's always with this very facile, snide.
Yes, it's exactly the way it was treated
directly, and it's just made all of us more curious about what it is, And so, if you're learning molecular or cell biology, and you're seeing these amazing processes at work, the information processing and DNA replication or in gene expression. I remember when I first took courses in these courses, fellow classmates would just say things like, no way, that's awesome. How does it know to do that? I mean, it's just, so the term intelligent design, I think, was actually a fairly bold stroke, because it really very aptly captures what many biology students are just seeing in their classes when they're learning about these processes,
regardless of their prior religious
exactly. And so this is weird protesting too much from the professorate, and I would find that rather delightful, actually.
Yeah. No, I was frustrated. This was in 2018, and I'm looking like these. I mean, these are academic theologians working out of Cambridge and stuff, and I'm like, they're not really engaging with the actual material. They're just hearing it from their science buddies who probably have other theological and metaphysical commitments. But so let me read this quote. I'll do my Peter Robinson.
Tony, I call that the all reasonable people agree phenomenon.
Yeah,
they're just
right.
They're part of the all reasonable people. So
this is from page 258 in the book. Quote, Stephen Meyer. Yet many theologians, made defensive by the long intellectual dominance of scientific materialism and the history of failed proofs for the existence of God, have been reluctant to consider the possibility that scientific evidence could have implications supportive of theistic beliefs, period, end quote. And maybe that's why I saw people have been so browbeaten in the theological world because of the scientific materialism that is now, we see, waning, that there's also sort of a real hesitation. And you guys, coming in with very strong arguments, and hopefully that needle is shifting. But I will say, I think, let me make we talked about then, this is an interventionist view of God's divine action. There are new inputs of information. We're detecting this in very specific historical instances, Cambrian explosion, new body plans, etc. The mechanism itself is not causally sufficient to be self-creating, self-replicating, self-making. But there's another.
Darwinian, you're saying it's not
the Darwinian mechanism, right? But now there's another aspect of God's providence that I think maybe is leading people to want to go to a more front-loaded view, and that is God's governance, right? That God is directing and guiding all things to certain purposes and ends. And this is where I think the problem of evil certainly raises its head. We say, like, look, to explain novel body parts and all these things, there's an influx of information, there's intervention there. But then the problem of evil raises its head, and we've heard these objections. Yeah, but what about what looks? Yeah, go ahead.
This term intervention is used as a sort of pejorative, and
yeah, I'm not using it that way, but yeah.
No, I understand that, and it's a fine way of describing it if you like. But I think it's better not to think of God intervening as if nature was something that could exist separate from Himself. The biblical view, and I think a theologically astute view, is that God is upholding the laws of nature. Mm-hmm. He's maintaining the existence of the universe on a moment-by-moment basis. Colossians 1, which Newton virtually paraphrased in the General Scholium to the Principia, says that in Christ all things are held together. Nature has an autonomous existence from God. It is semi-autonomous. It would not exist if God did not choose to hold it in existence and maintain the regular concourse of nature. So to say that God is intervening into that as if it was something wholly separate from His activity, right, is maybe not the best term. But
I would just say concursus in the Latin really better translates to participation or accompaniment, not intervention.
Or the idea that you have discrete divine action and ongoing divine action. This was the distinction between the two potentias, the potentia absoluta and the potentia ordinata. Anyway, I'm not a theologian, but I think some of these theological concepts are helpful. What's happened is that the theistic evolutionists have wanted to confine divine action to one modality, and that's
violation of.
That's it. Yeah, exactly, and that's in deference, I think, to the dominant naturalistic or materialistic zeitgeist of science over the last 150 years. But my only point is just that I don't see evidentially a need to do that. In fact, the evidence on its face seems to point towards many instances of discrete action, not just one at the origin of life or one at the beginning of the universe.
And isn't that how God relates to us spiritually as well? If the project of our human existence on this earth as Christians is partially at least soul-making capacities in order to shape us morally, doesn't God intervene spiritually in our lives, and we're new creations as well? So theologically, you can see that that's a common pattern. That's how He normally acts, both in the material world but also in the spiritual realm.
Yeah, I have found that in my personal life, that He shows up when you need Him.
So, Stephen, but then what about the objection of, look at all the predation, look at all the animal life that's gone in and out of existence over the millennia? I mean, which then there's a perception there, perhaps, that this can't be governed by a divine agent. So, I mean, and again, it's the problem of, especially in this case, maybe natural evil. So what would be your response to that objection, which you've dealt with several times, of course? But
yeah, well, it's a challenging question. My general approach is, or my answer to the question in general terms, is to say that we should expect two things when we look at nature if we are looking at it from a biblical point of view. I'm a proponent of intelligent design, but I'm also a biblical theist. And I think biblical theism has explanatory resources with respect to that problem that simply the theory of intelligent design simpliciter does not. So as a biblical a biblical theist who is an advocate of the theory of intelligent design, I expect to see two things in nature. I expect to see evidence, as Romans 1 puts it, from the things that are made of the wisdom and power of the Creator. And I think we do see that. In the book that you're holding is providing chapter and verse or documentation of that claim. But I think from a biblical point of view, we not only know that from the things that are made, you can see the unseen qualities of the Creator, his power and divine wisdom. We also should expect that the creation is somehow in bondage to decay. This is in the same book in the New Testament, the book of Romans, where Paul describes the way in which the things that are made reveal the Creator. He also is very explicit in affirming that there's something that's gone wrong in nature, and that just as if you look at an automobile, you can see the evidence of design in the structure of the internal combustion engine, you can also see evidence of decay in the rust on the engine or on the chassis. And the one does not negate the reality of the other. Both things, initial design and subsequent decay, are present. And this is what the biblical witness leads us to expect. We should expect to see these two things. And so I think some of the arguments for natural theology, especially in the 19th century, tended so much to emphasize the positive case for aboriginal design that they overlooked this second aspect of what we should see in nature. You had a kind of almost Platonic view of nature that viewed, or a Leibnizian view that said that, what we see in nature is the best of all possible worlds. There are no problems. But I think we as biblical Christians should expect to see both evidence of design and evidence of subsequent decay. That we see both of those things in nature, I think, is confirmatory of the hypothesis that you would generate based on a biblical metaphysic. So that's the general way I look at it. And there's stuff about viruses and bacteria. And I mean, a colleague of mine, Scott Minnick, works on virulence. And it happens that he tells me that microbiologists that work on virulence now know that all the really nasty bugs that we have acquired those nasty capabilities vis-a-vis humans as a consequence of a loss of genetic information, which I think is what you'd expect from the kind of view that we hold, that there was an aboriginal creation that was purely good, and there has been decay of that. And then there's a theological backstory to that we're partially told, but not entirely. So I don't think we have a full answer to it, but in very general terms, what we see is exactly what we should expect.
Right. No, and to get into
on a biblical view, yeah,
that would be a topic for another time.
Is not just the problem created by humans, but it's reflected in some way, has played itself out in nature, and there are different theodicies about how that has happened. And I have views on that, but I don't think we have the whole story. We're given a glimpse into a backstory, but we don't get the whole story as to how that arose.
Yeah, we won't do another hour here on theodicies. Maybe save that for another time. Okay, that's
my colleague Dembski, who's written a very interesting book on that. So
yeah. Okay, so I want to start drawing to a close here with maybe just a few more practical kind of questions for you. I think we've covered the book pretty well, some of the metaphysical options, why theism is the best option, and then also some of these questions about God's discrete divine action in the course of natural history. So for you then, working in this field with Discovery Institute, were you on board from the beginning with Discovery, or you came on relatively early in
the Institute, but with the program, the Center for Science and Culture? John West and I founded that in 1996. Discovery was founded by George Gilder and Bruce Chapman in 1990.
Yeah. So what would you hope for the evidence, the arguments you're making, and how ID can influence the church, maybe, as we said, the project of theology, our theology, and also the individual believer? How might this work out in the life of the individual believer?
I think we should have, people who believe in God should have a lot more confidence in their belief than they often feel they have a right to today, given the dominant and long dominant secular ethos. And we've actually had a PhD student who did a survey, did a study showing that students that are taught about the theory of intelligent design, then it was a longitudinal study. Students that are taught about intelligent design have a higher confidence in their faith down the road. There's a higher degree of faith retention and a greater degree of confidence in their faith, measured in part by their willingness to share it, than people who are not taught about these evidences. So I think, it's. I mean, I still have epiphanies about this. When you're thinking, there is a digital code inside every cell of every living organism. Bill Gates says it's like a software program. Where does software come from? It comes from a programmer. We're looking at this. Should be a stop press moment in the history of science and the history of biology. The discovery of this information and information processing system. It's a clear evidence of a high of the activity of a higher intellect, of a master programmer. When you have those sorts of evidences as part of what roots your belief, it has more ballast, and I think people should have more confidence. There's the case for theism is very, very strong. But I want to answer a question you didn't ask, which is about the benefits for science.
Well, that was my next question about the scientific community.
Because this is what we're working on now. A lot of scientists will see the problems with Darwinism and not see that the problems that they're seeing, for example, the presence of the circuitry that is involved in making body plans, is the flip side of a positive case for design. The only known cause of circuitry, or things that function like circuits, is intelligence. It's engineering. And so we're not just being confronted with something that's problematic for Darwinism. We're being confronted with evidence that is best explained by the activity of designing agents. Moreover, intelligent design doesn't just provide a better explanation of facts that we have long had. It actually helps. We have expectations. It generates expectations about what we should see in life, because we know something about the way designing agents act and the kinds of things that they generate, the kinds of signatures that are associated with intelligent activity. And so we ought, for example, to find design patterns that are known from computer science in the information processing system in the cell. And in fact, we're finding things like that. There was a very important prediction that ID people made in the 90s and 2000s about the so-called junk DNA. The Darwinists had concluded that the non-coding regions of the genome, the parts that weren't coding for proteins, were simply the leftover of the random trial and error process of mutation and selection, and they were junk. And we said, well, we accept that mutation and selection is a real process. There ought to be a little of that, but not 97% of the genome. If it was designed, we'd expect a much higher percentage of the genome to be functional. So we're going to predict that those non-coding regions are not junk, but are importantly functional. And it turns out, post-encode project 2011, they absolutely are importantly functional, and that the non-coding regions are involved in the timing, the regulation of the timing and expression of the data files of the modules that build the proteins. So ID is leading to predictions of that sort that are guiding research, and that's a very exciting aspect of a dynamic research program. So looking at life as a design system, we think will prove to be, and is proving to be, more fruitful than looking at life as the product of a bottom-up, unguided process that was blind, and what was the document?
Pitiless, which is a different kind of adjective.
That's not the things we're seeing don't look as if they were produced by that type of a process.
Well, and that's, I think, and one thing I haven't, I was thinking that maybe there's some research to be done here too, is with this framework of looking at the natural world and discerning in more and more detail design, it really liberates us to think about what we would call in classical philosophy final causation. Right? Things are designed for a purpose. They're moving towards an aim. And then I would wonder about how that might revivify a certain kind of natural law thinking that I think we desperately need in the culture as well. So I don't know if anybody's working on that, but that might be a project there on how.
Oh, there's a huge project there.
Yeah.
Mr. McIntyre, After Virtue, this
Yeah.
whole idea that the moral law is not something that has been imposed upon humankind to deprive us of fun, but it rather is to promote human flourishing. In other words, it was designed for our benefit, and it was given to match our design for our benefit. So I think the notion of design is, I think, very important in moral philosophy.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing more done there. Okay, last maybe 2 questions here. I got a bonus question for you, but it won't take you off, but surprise you too much, I think. So for the pastor, the average Christian, not that there is such a thing, but how can people get more engaged with the ID movement, be more supportive of it? Discovery Institute, what can people do to contribute to the project?
Right now, there's a little, if you go to my website or to any of the websites on the Discovery Institute, there's a little sign-up page to get a free booklet on the scientific evidence for God. And in getting the free booklet, all you have to do is provide your email. But then once you have the email, then you're part of our network, and we can send you information about conferences and updates on new scientific developments, and become a supporter if you want. I mean, that's one real practical way. If you go to stevencmeyer.org or discoveryinstitute.org, you can sign up, get that free booklet. I think we put this up for all the interest we were generating because of the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah,
but we're getting quite a lot of traffic as a result of that, which is great.
Oh, that is good. That is good. Yeah.
Also, we sometimes say we do wholesale. We need a lot of help with retail. We've got lots of YouTube video shorts, our Science Uprising series, a fine little video called The Information Enigma. Sharing this material with people who are wrestling with these big questions is something that is very much needed, and we very much appreciate when people get involved in that way. We also have a small donor society called our Discovery Society, and people that want to join that are invited every year to an insider's briefing. This year we're having it in Washington, D.C.
Yep, I'll be there. I'll see you there. Yeah.
So yeah, there's lots of ways to get involved. Go to discovery.org or stevencmeyer.org right now, and there's ways to click and connect.
Yeah, I would really encourage. I've benefited greatly from being a supporter of Discovery Institute the last couple of years. I've gotten to meet you once or twice now. I think once at Biola and then a couple of weeks ago again. And of course, I know Doug Axe a little bit, and really just in Eric Schneider. And it's just been great. It's been great to interact with you guys, and really appreciative of all the work you've done. So I would strongly encourage people to get the books, read the material, and then also get involved as well in the project. All right, Stephen, I got one bonus question for you, because last time we met, I found out you were a boxing fan like myself. So I got to ask you, Spence
reputable interest, no question. Yeah.
Spence versus Crawford. Who do you got?
Oh, yeah, Crawford's pretty tough, I think. Yeah.
Going with Crawford. Okay.
Yeah, interesting backstory there. Brian Callen had just, when I did the interview and debate conversation with Michael Shermer on his show, he'd just come back from sparring at Bernard Hopkins's gym.
Oh, really? Oh, man.
He's a boxer.
Executioner.
And so we had quite a conversation before the interview started about the the noble art, the sweet science,
Oh, I
and
love it.
various techniques.
Hagler was my guy. I was a Hagler fan.
He found out I had a Russian coach, so we talked a fair amount of technique. But anyway, I think I partially owe the invitation to Rogan to Brian Callen, because they're childhood friends, and they're
Oh,
very,
really? What a stroke of
both into the
providence.
fight game in a different way. Callen being a boxer, but Rogan, the MMA star, who's had an extraordinary career. Those guys are scary tough. I wouldn't get anywhere near anyone.
Yeah, right. Well, that's good. Well,
they have all the different tools, with the.
It's going to be a great fight either way. This is one I'm really looking forward to. But well, Stephen, this has been excellent. I really appreciate you taking the time now that, I mean, you're busier than ever, I'm sure. But it's been a blessing to have you here, and look forward to maybe doing it again another time on some of the other issues that we didn't have time to get into. So thanks for coming on the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you guys. Great questions. So plumbed the philosophical depths of a lot of this in some new ways. So I love it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.